Okay, so now back inside of the document store holder, we're going to create a new instance of this document store, and that lives under raven.clients.documents. So let's assign this property here. So one thing to note is that you should treat the document store as a singleton, meaning you shouldn't create new instances of it every time you need to use it. Rather, you should probably use a dependency injection framework and manage its lifetime as a singleton. Now, because I'm using ASP.NET Core, if we go into startup.cs, you can see down here, I have .NET managing its lifetime as a singleton. So that means I can inject this document store holder anywhere I need to use it and get a reference to the store, and there's only going to be one instance of it created for my application. Now the document store has a couple properties that we care about. The URLs property is the first one. And it takes an array of strings, which is a little different from the URL property that used to be on the document store. And this is because Raven is a distributed database, and you can actually put in the URLs for all of your nodes in your cluster. Since we're using the Community Edition and we're running on our local machine, we just have one node. This URL should look familiar because it's the URL that we use to go to the Raven Studio. Now what I would prefer to do is sort of make this a configuration rather than hard coding the URL in here. Using ASP.NET Core, I can use the I options, and it just wraps a plain old CLR object called Raven settings. So let's just go to that, hit F12, and you can see that it has a URL and a database string. And that's coming from the appsettings.json file. Here you can see we have a Raven property, and that is just a JSON object that has a URL and a database. So these are the values that we're going to inject through the I options and into our document store holder. So rather than hard coding this URL, I'm just going to come here and I'm going to change it. So now I have the settings.url, and the other property that we want to set on the document store is the database property. And I'm just grabbing that from our settings object too. If we go take a look at the appsettings.json, we can see the database here. So now we've created a new instance of the store, but it's not really doing anything. We actually need to initialize it so that it actually tries to connect to Raven. So I'm going to do that by doing store.initialize, and that should do it. So let's actually update this log message and then run the app. So it looks like the site is still working. Let's actually check and see if we see that log message we just modified. Here we go. You can see this log message here. So we initialized the RavenDB store. So that's great. Now, how do we actually use the store to do stuff? So what we need to do is we need to use something called a session. Off of the store, you can create a new session. So why don't we do that? So I'm wrapping it inside of a using block because the session is supposed to be disposed. So the lifetime of a session is a bit different than the store. The store should be treated like a singleton in that there should only be one instance running for your application. But a session is sort of like a unit of work, meaning you can open it and do some work and then dispose of it. So that's why we're using the using block. The other thing that we can do is rather than opening just a regular session, we could actually open an async session. And notice that we're not using the async or await keyword here. This is just creating a new instance of a session that supports async operations. So now if we take a look at the methods, we can see that we have load async, query, store async, etc. So now we're getting asynchronous methods. And this is what we're going to be using throughout our application. Let's go ahead and switch back to using just a synchronous session since I'm not in an async method. And let's just do a really basic operation. So we're going to talk more about the loading operation in the next video, but I just want to show something here. Let's go back to our application and refresh the page. So now this is interesting. Do you see here that it says database does not exist exception because the database Pluralsight RavenDB getting started does not exist. So notice back in our code, we had to go as far as actually trying to do an operation against the database for Raven to actually blow up and say that, hey, you don't have a database. I think this is pretty interesting. You might think that calling store.initialize or creating a new session would actually trigger the existence check for a database, but actually it's not until you actually try to go and do an operation where Raven actually checks that. So what we need to do, as you can imagine, is create that database. And you saw in an earlier video how we could use the Raven Studio to do that, but this time why don't we do it programmatically? So through the magic of video editing, I'm going to paste a big snippet of code and then walk through it. Ta-da! Okay, so there's some new code here now. So let's take a look. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this open session and move it. And I'm doing that because what we're going to do is we're going to say create database if not exists. So we're going to do some operations here that actually go and check whether or not we have a database or create one. So if we scroll down, there's a few things here. So Raven is built on the idea that there are tasks and operations, and these are the low-level commands that you can use to control Raven. So what we're doing is we're just saying, hey server, go and get me a database record from my database. If it returns null, then we know that the database doesn't exist, and so we can create a new database. And that's all this code here is doing. We're just using these operations to actually go and get the database information or create the new one. And if you notice down here, I'm actually loading the data from CSV, but ignore that. And it looks like we have a missing reference here. So in VS Code, control dot, go get the using statement up at the top, and we should be good to go. Let's refresh the page and see if there are any issues. All right, so it looks like we've booted up, and let's go in Raven Studio for a second. Would you look at that? So now we have the Pluralsight RavenDB getting started, and it looks like it created the database and even imported the documents from the CSV file. So there we created the database programmatically. If you're coming from versions of Raven prior to 4.0, that might surprise you that we had to actually create the database ourselves manually, because in earlier versions it actually did it automatically. So you might want to save that piece of code that we wrote so you can use it in your project. We're going to learn more about working with the session and different operations in the next few videos.